Your time is running out. If you want to get questions to us in time for our July Ask Us Anything episode, you need to submit them right now.
And you can submit those questions at GenreVision.com. There's a post that you can comment on with your questions, or at that same website, you can go to our contact page and email us questions privately if you'd like, but we need those questions.
As of right now, that Q&A episode's going to be real short, Chief. So if you want to make sure and get your questions answered, do it now or forever hold your peace.
We're gathered here today.
Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to plead for your questions.
Send in questions, everybody, please. Greetings, loyal listeners and new recruits. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And this is GenreVision. GenreVision is a weekly movie club where we discuss horror films, action movies, fantasy flicks, sci-fi cinema, and more. And we continue Time Travel Month with Time After Time, the 1979 featured directorial debut of Nicholas Meyer, who many people will know went on to be involved with the Star Trek franchise. This is actually based off a novel that was apparently being written at the same time the screenplay was being developed. Apparently, Meyer and the author of the book were kind of freely sharing ideas and collaborating together. This is one of those movies that I didn't grow up with it, and I know this for Travis was a first watch. I came to this much later, but it's always been a movie that I'm like, I'm surprised more people don't bring this up. But the basic premise is about as wacky accessible as you can get, particularly for, I think, science fiction, history nerds. The basic premise of Time After Time is H.G. Wells has to go into the future on this time machine that he built to catch Jack the Ripper, who has gone to then modern day San Francisco in 1979. And has to chase him down and catch him.
Yeah, I'm surprised more people don't talk about it just based on the premise alone, because the premise is pretty wacky. Okay, let's get nerdy science fiction author H.G. Wells, played by Malcolm McDowell, who was certainly a recognizable star at the time, having been in notable adaptations like Clockwork Orange, sure. And then you had David Warner, who, of course, is still an absolute stalwart of the screen. I love seeing David Warner in just about anything.
I've never seen a bad performance from David Warner, ever.
Nor I. I mean, he's just a legend. And so to cast him as Jack the Ripper is like, oh, that's instantly interesting. The movie starts in the London streets in the late 1800s, and we're seeing all the fog and all the steam and stuff.
The extremely foggy streets of London. This might be the foggiest I've ever seen the streets of London.
I mean, all this is after the opening credits, which, like you said, like the score is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. It's like, are you ready for a movie?
It's the kind of bombastic stuff that we really kind of don't hear a whole lot in scores nowadays. Like so many scores, I think, are really there to be kind of wallpaper, and that's not good or bad. It's all dependent on the score, but the score by Miklos Rosa is from this opening. It's a big bombastic grab you by the throat, like you're gonna watch a movie kind of experience. You're like, oh, okay.
Yeah. As soon as the music came in, I was like, what is this? An Irwin Allen like disaster movie?
Yeah, it's that
the
level.
Bottom of the sea, you know? So after we get through all that, we're in the London streets, and we don't know it at first, but the shot we're seeing is a POV shot. We see a woman of the night, shall we say, stumble out of a pub and into the street, and she locks eyes with the camera. She's looking right down the barrel, and she's having a conversation with somebody on the other side, and we obviously don't know who that is just yet. But this POV follows her into a nearby alleyway. Of course, it's Jack the Ripper, and we see a couple of crucial things here. We see that the Ripper has a gold pocket watch and places it on a nearby crate while he's got this sex worker up against the wall. He then proceeds to, out of frame, do what Jack the Ripper does and gut her. And there's a really disgusting bit of sound design here where they just include this sound of a piece of fabric ripping.
Yeah.
And we immediately know what they're trying to get across here, because the movie does a lot of work to avoid being really gory.
It's going for that PG.
Exactly. It's trying to skirt around not getting an R rating. but it's still brutal in moments where it wants to be. And this is certainly one of those moments.
We should clarify, it's going for a 1979 PG.
Right. Which just 4 years prior was Jaws, which, practically killed kids in the audience.
Exactly. So the thing is, I mean, when we see the Ripper killing and the effects that are left in his wake with his victims, it's grim. It's really effective stuff. And I think that's set up very well in this giallo opening.
Yeah, it is definitely sort of Italian inspired in a lot of ways. That POV feels very, it does feel very Argento.
I do like because when he opens up his watch, which plays this little tune that we'll hear consistently throughout the movie, and then he kills her. And then when he goes to pick up the watch, he's had these white gloves on and they're just totally drenched in blood.
Sure.
That's a kind of non-violent workaround to something that implies incredible violence.
And I mean, we do see her sort of slumped against the wall of the alleyway, and her abdominal area is covered in blood. They're not going to show her guts strewn about everywhere.
Right. We don't see any particular wound or anything, but and then as we leave the alleyway, there is a trail of blood trickling down into the gutter. It's great. I love this opening.
So after that, after a brief moment with a cop seeing the body in the alleyway, we transition to what appears to be just like a jolly old, late 1800s men with mustaches party in the parlor of none other than author H.G. Wells, played by Malcolm McDowell, as we said. And there's a lot of standing around and smoking jackets and pipe smoking and swilling of brandy and playing of chess. And it's, folks that are rubbing elbows with H.G. Wells. And here's where we get the sort of big character beats and a little bit of, exposition where Wells starts to talk about his philosophies and his political leanings. And we can tell pretty quickly that he's a really progressive guy for the era, wants to believe in social programs and believes in the future that if we invest enough in social programs, that we can eradicate illness and, we can strive for utopia. And he believes in the free love movement, or what he called the free love movement at the time. It's not what we think of as the free love movement from the 1960s or the 70s, but he clearly is laying out this sort of progressive ideology.
Yeah, I mean, he straight up says the word socialism, and one of his hobnob friends says like, "Oh, don't get him started on socialism. We'll never hear the end of it."
Yeah.
And it's a very pointed political place to introduce the character. It's not just like H.G. Wells. I bet he was a goofy guy that liked fantasy stuff. It's like, no, he was extremely politically minded, and the relationship that is forged between him and David Warner's character, Stevenson, who arrives at the party late, and they start talking, and it is immediately a trope, and it's trite, but my God, does it work? They're long-standing chess opponents, and Stevenson is always beating HG at chess because he's like, I know how you think, HG, but you need to figure out how I think to beat me. And Stevenson's beliefs are completely in opposition to HG. He talks about, everything you say, we're just animals. Human beings have been unchanged for thousands of years. We hunt and are hunted.
Right. There is a sort of equating of Stevenson's predatory ideas with a sort of fatalism and pessimism, and H.G. Wells being the atheist optimist and wanting to believe, the humanist, I guess, the eternal humanist, wants to believe that there is an extraordinarily bright future for humanity that is seemingly just out of grasp for him.
Right.
He believes that it's right there. And this, of course, has made him build a time machine.
Yes. And it should be, because this is important to the story. And if you know about H.G. Wells, he has not written novels at this point in his career. He's not written the time machine.
Right.
But it turns out that, yes, he has built this time machine. And Stevenson, who I have to say, and we'll talk about this, I think, a little bit more, their relationship is so very, I think, I have to believe the people that watch some of the X-Men movies saw time after time, because it's a very Charles Xavier Magneto kind of thing where they are enemies and they are opposed to each other, but there is this level of gentlemanly respect even after HG finds out that Stevenson is the Ripper. So we reveal this time machine in his basement, and Stevenson's deeply interested in it. And HG explains how it works, and everybody's, kind of like, like, not paying him any mind. And then, of course, the police show up and say there's been a murder. The Ripper's in the area. and they investigate the house. They look in Stevenson's doctor's bag, find bloody gloves. Boom, we found the Ripper. He's decided to abscond with the time machine and has gone into the future to escape the police.
Yeah, there's a little bit of confusion about the mechanics of how the time machine works when HG is explaining the functionality of the time machine to everybody, which has a really fun design, by the way. There is this little, I don't know, if it's like a car, there's like a little area where the gas cap might be. Right. That almost looks like a place you can pull off. And one of the people points at it and goes, "What's this doohickey?" And he goes, "That's the extremalizing vaporizer. I don't know, the everlasting gobstopper, some bullshit, the bingo boinger."
That's the goober.
Yeah, exactly. And he says, if you pull this out, the machine don't work and you die.
It's a little bit more complicated than that. That is what happens. Sure. But the idea being that this is the thing that regulates the time machine's ability to basically move through time. So if you got in the time machine and this thing wasn't in it, you would just pretty much go through time through into infinity.
Right. You without the machine. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Without the machine. Setup. That's been set up. It's like, this is like when we did our Time Cop episode where they're like, matter can't occupy the same space. We're like, well, there's a reason they keep harping on the gas cap thing here.
Yeah, that's coming back. So the Ripper steals the time machine. The machine vanishes, and you would think, oh no, without the time machine, how is H.G. Wells going to chase the Ripper into the future? Well, Mr. Clever H.G. Wells thinks of everything because he has another bingalizing goober, whatever the fuck it is, that brings the time machine back to him if you don't have it. So he looks at the dashboard of the time machine and sees that the Ripper has gone to 1979. And so H.G. Wells gets into the time machine and feels at this point he has no choice but to chase down Jack the Ripper in 1979.
And we get a wonderfully trippy time travel sequence, which, and this is one of my big things about this movie, feels kind of out of a different era, a past era. And that's how a lot of the effects do in this movie, because this isn't really an effects movie.
No, this feels very Doctor Who-y in terms of effects, where you're like, that's a little more kind of low-key and old-fashioned than I thought it might be. It's not a boundary-pushing effects film.
Well, and I have to imagine that it felt extremely quaint 2 years after Star Wars. And, you know, this came out, I don't know if it came out after, but it came out the same year as Alien. And this is clearly a hearkening to a much more classical, old-fashioned approach to science fiction. I believe they had some props and stuff from some other H.G. Wells movies and adaptations that show up in the movie, much in the same way that they had some of the lab equipment from Frankenstein and Young Frankenstein. Like this definitely feels very much in love with this kind of retro future idea that is presented in H.G. Wells. So the time machine is this clunk. Like I don't get me wrong, I really enjoyed this movie and I really like the time machine, but it looks like a shopping mall kiddie ride.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of looks like a low rent Chitty Chitty Bang Bang meets the time machine from the George Pal movie. You know, that's kind of what it looks like to me. But it's at the same time kind of adorable. Like I liked it. We get this extended time travel psychedelic sequence, which is like suitably, 1979 trippy. And Malcolm McDowell's H.G. Wells ends up in San Francisco in 79. And he begins his detective story, and there are a couple of plot beats here that kind of lead him around. He first off needs to figure out like how much the stuff he's brought with him is worth, because he knows he's going to need money. And so he starts going to currency exchanges and banks, and he starts to pawn off some jewelry he's brought with him because he knows that's going to have a certain amount of value. And he winds up at the Bank of England, and that's kind of our first big plot point.
Yes, because he's also trying to find out. He's like, well, Stevenson would have had to do this too. So if I can go to these different banks, I can inquire, like, have you seen a man? This is what he looks like, and try and find him. All the while, he is being exposed to life in 1979 and getting culture shocked. I mean, there is fish out of water stuff in here that's played pretty straightforward for comedy, but more so, it's kind of a mean outset at first, because a big core premise is like, what if we took this futurist from the past and actually showed them what happened? What would their response be? And I think it's so crucial, and we'll talk about this later, that this story has to take place before he writes the time machine, because the time machine has very different outlooks on the future than you would think with this version of H.G. Wells, who is extremely optimistic and like, oh, we're going to have utopia in like 80 years.
Right.
Instead, he's, when he goes to sell his jewelry, I don't know if this was cut or if it's just supposed to be kind of a for us thing. I don't know. When he's selling to the jeweler, he sees that the jeweler has a concentration camp tattoo on his arm. There's just little things like that. Like, for example, that's a very dark thing, but one of his first experiences is he's at a crosswalk that says don't walk, and he sees people walking. So he obviously is like, oh, okay, starts walking, and immediately two cars like almost hit him and crash into each other. I mean, it's a funny moment, but it illustrates this kind of contradiction of what he's experiencing with what his beliefs would be about the future.
Sure. And some of this fish out of water stuff is my least favorite stuff in the movie. For a couple of reasons. Number one, a lot of these fish out of water gags are kind of painfully dated. When he walks, when he walks out of the museum that he winds up in San Francisco, there's this horde of Hare Krishnas that he's got to walk through, and I'm like, woof. What is it? Did I walk into Airplane for a moment here? It's extraordinarily dated.
This is the thing that anytime you make a movie or a story where you are trying to focus on ideas of modernity, you immediately date yourself. It's an unavoidable thing. When you're like, wow, look at how modern life is in 1963. It's like,
sure.
Well, trust me, it ain't going to stay that way.
It's also like stuff like he goes into a McDonald's and he watches the guy order in front of him. And then, of course, once McDowell gets up, or H.G. Wells gets up to the front of the line, he repeats the last guy's order. I'll have a Big Mac, please, and French fries. And it's like, this is tedious. I was not having any fun during these kinds of scenes. And the little bits of fun I did manage to find were kind of for ironic reasons. Like once he sits down at the table and starts eating French fries, he notices that the table has like that, it's either a plastic table or it has like a plastic finish on it. And he's like, I never saw wood like this. And he's rubbing his hands all over it. And I'm like, this is just fucking silly.
Well, I think part of your feelings about that also have to do with the fact that you were not super into Malcolm McDowell in the movie.
No, I think the stuff where he's this really wide-eyed and boyish idealist in San Francisco doesn't really work for me. I don't see Malcolm McDowell as that character. It just, for whatever reason, like after you see Caligula, you're like, I don't know, he's not that guy anymore.
Well, I mean, life lesson, don't see Caligula.
Absolutely. Do not see Caligula, whatever you do.
Yes. So, because it will ruin everything about your life, including how you view Malcolm McDowell. Because I like him in this. I don't think he's great. I'm not trying to argue that this is some secret, amazing Malcolm McDowell performance, but I think what he's being asked to do, being this very boyish, very naive, bookish type, I think he does it pretty well. The real problem comes in the fact that you got David Warner as Jack the Ripper in this movie.
Yeah, and Malcolm McDowell's not a bad actor, but I think, when I saw him in the Cat People remake again recently, I was like, this is the kind of shit that I think Malcolm McDowell really excels at. Like, put crazy contacts in him, have him chew his own skin off or whatever the fuck he does in that crazy movie.
You don't like him in Caligula, but it's like, just put him in weird sex movies.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. No, I like Malcolm McDowell, but I just don't think the sort of wide-eyed, boyish naivety of this role suits him. Meanwhile, you have David Warner, who has played some real big scumbags too. Like, I just rewatched Titanic last year and I was like, oh well, yeah, he plays a really good hench for Billy Zane's character in this movie. So having Warner as this very sadistic and predatory, but also like worn out character, there's a tiredness to the Ripper in this that I really liked. And they finally meet up with one another after H.G. Wells finds his way to the Bank of England, which of course is accompanied by because it's very broad.
That's not the only time in the score when he first exits the museum and sees the American flag. There's just a few notes of Star Spangled Banner in the score.
Sure. Yeah, this is a very kind of broad and silly comedy in moments.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. It's going for that. This is an extremely attempting to be a 4-quadrant movie for 1979.
Yeah, but then you have Jack the Ripper who's like hacking people up, and like later on in the movie we see like severed limbs and rooms covered in blood. It's crazy.
The sentiments were different, man. Like that was something that I think there was a pass on, depending on how it's depicted, because I think the way that it's depicted in this movie clearly it was enough to pass to get a PG, from the MPAA at the time. And I think that, like you said, Jaws came out 4 years earlier, and that was like everybody loved that. Kids loved Jaws.
And Jaws is very funny as well, and has some moments of broad comedy. They're karateing the picket fences. I get it.
Sure. And back to David Warner, the thing, the big, when they finally meet, and it's kind of the great idea of the movie, is that H.G. Wells comes to the future and is somewhat aghast. Like, I mean, he's very wowed by a lot of things, but his big ideas about where society would progress have been totally shattered. Whereas Jack the Ripper is like, I was born to be in this era. Look at this. And he pats it. He's like, come sit on my bed. And there's nothing queer about this at all. Come sit on my hotel bed in San Francisco.
Just two grown men sharing a hotel bed in San Francisco.
Yep. And he flips through the channels and is just, seeing a ton of topical stuff. I mean, even during his psychedelic, Willy Wonka moment, we hear all this radio stuff of, like Nixon being impeached and all this kind of stuff. And so David Warner's flipping through the channels and just showing tons of horrific stuff, including football.
Horrifying.
Yeah. But to show, it's like, they've been exactly what I said they were. They're animals. He's like, the future is made for me. You're outdated. And there is sort of this moment of HG kind of reckoning with that.
Sure. And it's also at this moment that we see like the flaws in the Ripper's argument, because really what the Ripper is talking about isn't necessarily that the world is a more violent place after their time, in Victorian England. What they're talking about is the media in a sense. They're talking about the accessibility of violence. They're talking about, the current political climate in the U.S., obviously, and also what kind of social services were available in places like San Francisco then.
Well, and I think it's also direct, because I was thinking about this where I'm like, this movie has to happen after a certain period, because it has to happen post-Vietnam, post-Watergate.
Right. It has to be in an American downswing and an era of American pessimism, basically.
Cynicism.
Yeah.
Like not necessarily pessimism, but specifically cynicism, where it's like all these things, it's bullshit. And like, let's just, live hedonistically and let's just cater to all of our base impulses. And that's something that clearly Stevenson is like, yeah, it proves that I was right. And it proves like, look how well I can flourish here. I've already been killing people and I'm still not getting caught. Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful argument. I mean, this is sort of it's not, again, not directly, but I think it's very much in the vein of Professor X Magneto type discussion.
Sure. He's wrong, but I can see why he believes he's right, which is crucial.
Right. So eventually, Stevenson escapes from H.G. Wells, and they have a big chase scene, and he gets hit by a car. And you're like, what?
This chase scene, you describe it as big. I think it's pretty dinky, and it's I think the most unimpressive bit of direction from Meyer in this movie. Meyer got way better with action throughout his, even in his next movie, Wrath of Khan. But I think this chase scene is pretty silly. I mean, I still was having some like bizarre flashbacks from like Austin Powers, this sort of like Brit fish out of water stuff, time travel. It just wasn't fully clicking for me. There is a scene, after Jack the Ripper is hit by a car, H.G. Wells goes to a nearby hospital where he believes Stevenson has been taken in. And he walks into the emergency room and he sees what basically looks like a war-torn country. It's all these people walking around with like bleeding wounds. Oh my God, my eye, my leg.
Nobody's being attended to. It
is so silly.
I think I disagree with your read on it, because again, it's directly referencing a specific comment that HG makes in his opening scene about medicine, where he's like, well, we'll have medicine for everybody and everybody will be taken care of. And when he comes into this, he is just absolutely horrified and
the place is a fucking abattoir. Yeah.
Like, there's just people bleeding everywhere, and he's, nobody's being attended. And he's told that who they believe is Stevenson died. And so he's kind of in a stuck. I mean, he's not totally stuck, but he's kind of emotionally stuck. And he goes back to the person that he met at the bank, who we've not mentioned yet, Amy, who is played by Mary Steenburgen, who is who is written to be a verging on caricature idea of the modern 1979 San Franciscan woman.
Yes, she is this sort of caricature of a liberated woman. She's very sort of stoned in her speech pattern. She has this sort of like East Coast accent thing going on.
I mean, that's a very Mary Steenburgen thing all around. Like,
sure,
that's just her.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it's really exaggerated in this performance, and it's not a bad thing because she's funny in the movie. You know, very charming. You know, she's so deep in the like, oh, it's far out, man. It really turns me on.
I mean, well, there's some stuff here that does not pass the wokeometer, that she says, being a progressive woman in 1979.
Oh, sure. Yeah. But I mean, it was 79. You know, people don't have the same vocabulary here.
Sure.
She says something about,
oh, don't get me wrong. I didn't mean to imply it was the dyke.
And it's like, whoa,
well,
God.
she also, because she's immediately infatuated with HG when he first walks in. And after she leaves, she's talking to her worker friend. Her worker friend's like, man, you're really into this guy. And she's like, well, at least he's not gay.
Right. Yeah.
And it's like, whoa, where did that come from? But Mary Steenburgen is absolutely, I love her in this movie so much. She's extremely, just really, really approachably sweet. I mean, granted, writing wise, it is a love at first sight thing for her. She's just absolutely head over heels for HG the moment he speaks to her.
Oh, it's more than just love. Like, this movie definitely makes a point of saying, like, this woman lusts after HG Wells. She's always talking about how physically attractive she thinks he is.
Yeah, there's another line in here that does not pass the wokeometer.
Yeah, their love scene later on is preceded by an astonishingly outdated dialogue scene where you're like, oh my God, I can't believe she said that.
Yep.
More so it's I can't believe that was written as a line for that person to say. It's not so much that she said it. It was more that it was like, wow, I can't believe that line was written for that person to say. So here's another issue I have with this movie. Like, there are some great ideas about this romantic pairing. They were married for like 10 years. Obviously there was some chemistry there, but the movie takes a really significant aside in terms of running time to spend time developing this romance. And I get it. It's important. But they go on these long, this long dinner date up at the top of this one building where there's a rotating restaurant to show off the skyline. And it's, wow, very, very dated. You can see the whole place, I'm sure, smells like tobacco smoke. And it's like, God damn, 79. They are doing more pretty good character development here, like talking about their philosophical and political differences. There are moments in their conversations where both of them have to realize just like how progressive or not progressive they really are. Like, for instance, when H.G. Wells walks into the bank and he sees Mary Steenburgen there, he assumes that she's kind of, I don't know, a receptionist or something. And he goes, "Can I talk to a gentleman, please?" or something like that. And, she gives him some shit about it, and rightfully so. And he goes, "Oh, of course, I am for women's liberation. Okay, I will talk to you." Like, confronting beliefs, it's challenging their own progressive beliefs of like, am I really that progressive? Okay, I guess I am. So here we go. There are some fun moments of that, but it's nowhere near as compelling as what goes on between the Ripper and H.G. Wells.
Well, yes, this period where HG believes that Stevenson is dead, we know he's not. So if you're like, I want what was promised on the poster, HG versus Ripper, this is where it's like, oh, right, this is also trying to be a wide-reaching kind of fantasy romantic comedy type deal. And I think the relationship building is really fun. I really like McDowell and Steenburgen together. So I don't feel I wasn't there like, oh, get back to the Ripper, but I totally understand, like, that's what you want, especially when, look, I like the three main leads in this. I think they're all doing good, but there is no question David Warner as Jack the Ripper in 1979 is the thing that's like, yeah, it's like any great villain where you're like, you know what? I want to spend more time with that villain because the villain is often the most compelling part of a story.
Yep. And so there are scenes of him actually doing some killing. Like, there is one where he goes back to this one woman's apartment and she tries to get him to smoke pot with her. And the murder is there, and it happens just off screen. There's a lot implied, but the sort of impact to that moment is still felt quite heavily.
I want to boost up Nicholas Meyer as a director because I do think this is a well-directed film. In this moment, the way the Ripper kills her is he slashes at her, and at the moment of impact, they cut to this spinning camera move where it like just spins around the room. And then when it comes back and it lands on, it doesn't land, like the cut makes it look like it lands on David Warner's face. There's just a single drop of blood that has hit him on his face near his eye, so it looks like a tear. I love that kill so much. It's another one where it's like, this is doing violence by implying great impact, but not having to show stuff that's going to, cost you your PG rating.
Sure. And it's still, a scary scene. I wouldn't call Nicholas Meyer a great director of horror, although there are elements of horror in this film. It's marketed as a thriller. They use the word thriller on the poster, for instance, but thriller isn't something that I often use the argument that thrillers aren't really a thing. They're just horror movies that present themselves a little bit differently or for a slightly different audience.
Well, and thriller is a term I think is because you'd be like a political thriller. It's like, what the fuck does that mean?
Exactly.
So I think thriller as a term, I agree. I hate the term thriller as a term to describe stuff because I think it's just a shorthand to kind of not have to get into maybe a stickier explanation because me, I'll call anything horror. Time After Time is not a horror movie at all. Like it's really not going for that through the majority of it. Like you said, there are horror moments or even horror sequences, but it is not tonally in the filmmaking or the writing going for horror for a big chunk until the third act.
Right. That's when the horror really comes around and we see a lot more of, the Ripper stalking, people at a disco at night and, some really strong sense of a ticking clock. There is one point where they're at the museum and H.G. Wells is trying to prove that he is H.G. Wells to Mary Steenburgen's character. And something they find there is a newspaper from the future, like a couple days in the future. And it says that Mary Steenburgen's character is going to die.
When he finally reveals I'm H.G. Wells and I'm from the past and she doesn't believe him, he takes her to the museum and he's like, all right, we're going to get in the machine and we're just going to go to next Saturday. And so he does it, and it looks like nothing's changed. Then she gets out, and she's like, "Yeah, you were bullshitting me." And as they're exiting the museum, there's a little newspaper stand or something. Like there's a couple newspapers on a counter, and she looks at it and sees like, "Oh my God, this is the Saturday newspaper." And she starts looking through it, and that's when she sees a big photo of herself saying that she is the Ripper's newest victim.
Right. So we know now that there is a date and a time where she's going to die by the Ripper's hand. And so HG and Amy now have to do everything they can to prevent it. And I was like, okay, great. That's good conflict. We now have got this time bomb that's going to go off. And the third act of it does a great job managing conflict. The tonal shift into this third act, I think, is executed really well. Whereas I was having some kind of issues with conflicting tonal elements earlier in the movie, I'm like, okay, I think this all works. Because it has abandoned, the sort of goofier stuff. There is a couple scenes where H.G. Wells is arrested, and I'm like, this is working really well.
Well, in a lot of ways, this is a much more old-fashioned approach in the writing, too, where it's a build-up to the third act. It's not more modern sensibility where it's like, all right, every 15, 20 minutes, you got to have this beat happen,
right?
This action beat. There's got to be a confrontation with the Ripper and HG where they're fighting on the Golden Gate Bridge or something. It's like, no, that's not really what this movie's vibe is. And as such, I totally can understand being like a chunk of the movie feeling like I'm not getting what I was promised, but it's because don't worry, it's all been working in unison to get us to this third act so that, yeah, some of the comedy may not have been successful. Maybe some of the romantic stuff was a little bit tedious, but by the end, totally invested in the characters, the drama that's going on. And in that third act, it continues to raise the conflict and the tension in such great, unexpected ways that it's not just like, all right, we know you're going to die. How do we plan to stop that? And then they execute the plan. It's like, no, immediately HG ends up getting arrested because they think he might be the Ripper. And now they've set up this whole plan where it's like Mary Steenburgen's going to stay at this place and then eventually she's going to go to a hotel and she's taken some Valium to wait while he goes and buys a gun. But then he's immediately arrested, and now she's knocked out, and that's when the Ripper's going to show up. It's like, oh, fuck.
Yeah, and there's other stuff like, they're trying to prevent the Ripper from killing a new woman, and they are in their car, they're driving down the street, and they get a flat tire, and their plan is screwed because just a few minutes later they see them lifting a dead hooker out of like a canal or something like that.
What a shot.
Jesus, really grim stuff. This is the kind of stuff I was missing throughout the movie all along. Like, I guess coming to some, summation of my thoughts here. It's a pretty good flick. I was not cold on it as a whole. There were parts of it where I thought, this does not work for me. Or there were certain performances where I thought this aspect of the performance just doesn't work for me. But by the third act, I think the movie had, tied things up really nicely.
Things got better for you in the third act, and with some of your specific criticisms, like you were not very into Malcolm McDowell's performance, but in the third act, when he's kind of thrown into a hectic frenzy and really panicked about Amy's potential death, you kind of you were like, oh, his bigger acting is working better for this stretch of the movie.
Right. Like when he's in the interrogation room at the police station, the direction changes to sort of suit his performance and the tone of the movie. Like there are all these really extreme Dutch angles and like really rapid and effective cross-cutting in scenes. And I'm like, this is what I like. Like, this is really great. I think the movie is trying to be a little bit too much and is trying to accomplish a little bit too much tonally, where it's like, oh, we're going to be sort of a broad, silly fish out of water comedy. We're going to be a sweet romance. We're going to be a slasher film in some aspect. It's going to be a science fiction, rollicking chase across time. Like, I think all of those things are, admirable in their own regard, but like mashed together in this form, I think it's a bit unwieldy. I think there's so much good here that could have been, if you whittled away at this a little bit and you further solidified the idea, I think there's a great movie hiding in there. I just don't think this is that great movie, but it's pretty good.
I really like this movie quite a bit. I like the performances. I like how it builds to that third act, where the third act does turn into a horror movie. And granted, I think, considering who we are, we're going to like that regardless more than a lot of other things.
Sure.
But I do think it earns that third act a lot. And it earns the direction it goes, because it gets genuinely creepy. Like, it's not a creepy movie much at all until that third act. And there's legitimately eerie scenes. The most violent thing we see, in which we believe that Amy is murdered, and the police get to her place too late, and there's blood all over the walls and a severed hand on the floor. And it's like, oh shit, did this movie kill Amy?
Yeah, for a moment there, it really has you questioning that. It's a really brutal image.
Yes, but I think between the performances, particularly David Warner's, I think the idea is such a fun one, and one clearly that has been, I think ripped off in certain other places, even by its own creator, which we'll talk about in a little bit.
Yep.
I think the idea is so ripe. And I won't disagree with you where I'm like, there could be a better version of this movie, and particularly in the things that I would want to see more of. Because yes, there's a big stretch where we're not getting Jack the Ripper, and me being me, I'm like, I would not say no to more David Warner as Jack the Ripper.
Absolutely.
Like, I'm not going to like poo-poo. It's like, oh no, I really care. I want to sacrifice Jack the Ripper time for romance stuff. I'm going to be like, no. If those are my only two options, give me David Warner as Jack the Ripper. But I think everybody's doing a really good job. I think obviously Mary Steenburgen is really solid in this, and would go on eventually to have to do the same thing again in Back to the Future Part 3, which I'm sure will be some shelf picks for some people. I think this is the kind of movie that I would love to have a cult for, but it would always be a small cult. This isn't something that I think really has breakout cult potential. It's a little too wacky, I think. And that's okay. Like, that's one of the reasons why I like it.
Yeah, it's definitely got a very specific flavor going on, or a specific series of flavors. But if you wanted to find something that was similar, perhaps a little bit more palatable, or maybe just, on the same wavelength, you would go to The Shelf. The shelf is kind of a collaborative thing we do here at GenreVision. Every week we find some substitutions or pairings from our own shelves. And if you want to pull something off of your shelf, you can do so at GenreVision.com. Just go there and find the post on the main page for this episode and leave your shelf picks in the comments. Drew, what are you pulling off the shelf for Time After Time?
Well, at the end of Time After Time, H.G. Wells does go back in time and he has to write the time machine. So why the fuck wouldn't you watch the George Pal Time Machine immediately after this movie? George Pal's The Time Machine, I think, is top tier dad sci-fi. And I say that because it was one of my dad's favorite movies. We didn't own it, but whenever it was on TV on, TCM or AMC, man, we were watching The Time Machine. Time After Time feels like a movie that stylistically, in a lot of ways, should have been made in 1960 when the George Pal Time Machine came out. It feels very old-fashioned and clunky in an endearing, purposeful way. And that's one of the things I love about the George Pal Time Machine. I mean, it's an absolute landmark effects film. But yeah, like the Morlocks look like creatures from an episode of Star Trek: The Original Series.
Exactly.
That's okay.
Yeah.
It's great. Like, it's awesome. The Morlocks rule. They are classic movie monsters, but they look like Star Trek TOS monsters. And there's that level of like clunky endearingness to it. It's a wonderful movie. It's one of those movies that obviously shaped a generation as far as their interest in sci-fi. And the design of the time machine alone is so iconic that I think it still resonates for certain people this day. And I've never seen that Guy Pearce one, and I probably never will.
I saw it, and from what I remember from it, it really sucked.
That's the consensus. So, but Travis, what are you going to pull off the shelf for Time After Time?
If you're looking for a science fiction fish out of water comedy set in San Francisco that has a writing credit from Nicholas Meyer, you're not going to do any better than Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, which is a very good movie.
As we said earlier, Nicholas Meyer was ripping himself off like from Time After Time. But I think to some of your criticisms, some of the elements of Time After Time that you weren't as hot on have been thoroughly put through the polish machine by the time Star Trek IV comes out.
Totally. And I think these performers and these characters are much more suited to the fish out of water stuff. There's a lot more of that idea of, utopian ideals versus the reality of, late 20th century America and that clash. Here in Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, it's less depressing. They don't linker on that stuff too much, although it's there. The whole sequence set in the hospital is really funny.
Well, I mean, it's a wonderful inverse of Time After Time because this is the utopian future people coming back to our savage past.
Right, seeing just how barbaric it was in 1986. Yeah.
So immediately there's an establishment of like, oh, it's okay because we know things are going to work out all right. So when Scotty grabs a mouse and puts it up to his mouth and goes, computer, like that's just as stupid as the way Malcolm McDowell orders at a McDonald's. But there's like an endearingness to it. One, because it's James Doohan being Scotty, but also it's like, oh yeah, that guy, that's lovable. It's okay. The future's fine.
Right. Yeah. I think this is a real testament to just how strong a lot of those characters were. They were so well established, of course, through years and years of television and prior films, but they're so well established that they're versatile enough to be put in a silly fish out of water comedy, and to really take the piss out of the whole idea. Like, oh, these characters deal with these important humanitarian crises across the galaxy, and sometimes they go back to Earth and they don't know how to ride the bus without doing the Vulcan nerve pinch on some guy with a loud boombox. It's just really fun, and Nimoy's direction on it's great.
It's a good looking movie. I mean, yeah, you can't beat Captain Kirk going, well, double dumbass on you.
Yeah,
like how can you beat that? It's wonderful
poetry.
So yeah, absolutely. Voyage Home's wonderful film. Well, we don't have listener shelf picks this week, and that's because if you go to our Patreon at patreon.com/GenreVision, you can listen to a free episode of our pre-show that's still up right now and explains why we're not doing the listener shelf picks for these last few weeks of episodes. But don't worry, we still want you to submit your shelf picks at GenreVision.com by commenting on the post for this episode, and they will be collected together for a pretty much maxi shelf pick mini episode that we'll be doing in the future. So now, and on that note, while you're at patreon.com/GenreVision, you can become a premium subscriber for just $5 a month and get access to all of our bonus material, which includes weekly pre-shows. We do monthly extended currently consumings, often with our GenreVision sister, Danny Ryan. Hi, Danny. And a ton of other bonus stuff for all of the GenreVision network of shows. That's at patreon.com/GenreVision. And last but not least, if you love what we're doing here, please leave a review on the Apple Podcast Store. Rate the show. It really does help us out. We need reviews all the time. We cannot say enough. So if you have left a review and rated the show, you're an angel. If you haven't yet, it's a good chance to become an angel. And if you do leave a written review, we will feature it here on the show. Let's do some currently consuming. Nom, 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 nom. Travis, what's been on your plate?
Well, I've had a little bit of time to explore some of the offerings that Apple has on their Apple TV Plus service. One of the newest things they have is an adaptation of Stephen King's Lizzie's story, starring Julianne Moore and Clive Owen, and actually a really strong cast. Dane DeHaan is in there as well, and some really great stalwarts. Jennifer Jason Leigh is there. This has not been getting a whole lot of great critical acclaim. The whole series is 8 episodes. It's written by King. King wrote the teleplay himself, and it's directed by Pablo Larraín, who is kind of an art housey, international film director. And I had seen, I think, 1 or 2 of Larraín's movies, but I can see why critics weren't digging it, because it doesn't really have the expected rhythms of modern prestige television. It is running on a whole different kind of idea of pacing and editing, and I will say that there is some stuff in it that is downright sort of art housey pretentious from the direction and editing side, and I'm not terribly surprised by that. The teleplay from Stephen King, I think, has been adapted to suit the format quite a bit more than people were expecting. I haven't read the book yet, but it's my plan to. And one of the things I didn't know about it, and one of the things that was kind of minimized about this in marketing, is that J.J. Abrams is one of the producers on it.
Oh yeah, he's been producing King stuff for a while.
Now, if J.J. has had his sticky little fingers in this, I'm hard pressed to tell exactly where his fingerprints are on it, because this is, it's not very Abramsy. There are some moments where it's like, oh, there'll be one short random shot at the end of an episode of something entirely unrelated, and it's like, oh, is that just there to like tease people and keep them coming back as mystery box stuff? Like, I don't know. The rest of the show isn't really content on doing that stuff. Mm-hmm. So I can see why people aren't liking it. I think there is a core of something really good and interesting going on in Lizzie's story, and I will continue to stick with it, because when it does cool shit, it's really cool.
I'm intrigued by it, but it sounds like something that if and when I watch it, it will be when the entire thing is available to me to digest at my own pace. It does not seem like something that is built for a weekly release.
I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. Only time's going to tell here. So I'm happy to continue watching it, week to week at this point. But we'll see. I'll give folks an update on that on the extended currently consuming or something else. So. What's new for you, sir? What's been on your plate?
The week that this came out, that we're recording, the amusement park, the quote lost George Romero film, has been uploaded to Shudder. I watched it, and I going in, I had a very different level of entry point than I think the majority of the marketing and the discussion has been around it, because it's like, I read up on what this was, because when it first came out, like, there's a lost George Romero film coming out. It's like, oh, fucking what? Like, that sounds incredible. And then reading, it's like, oh, okay, it was an industrial film.
Sure.
Like, and fine. Like, I have expectations changed. And then it's like, yeah, it's not even 60 minutes. It's not really a feature. Like, it's an industrial movie that was made, for a particular reason, with particular tenets in mind, that it had to hit for, the Lutherans that were funding it or whatever. Yeah. And it is funded by a Lutheran organization in the credits. That's why I specifically say that. But that being said, I think the amusement park is an incredible display of why George Romero was a fantastic filmmaker and artist, and particularly genre storyteller, because making the basic thing, the PSA that they're trying to talk about is ageism, and the how old people have it hard, in society in 1973 or whatever.
This movie brought to you by old people.
Well, and so within that, it's led by I can't remember his name right now. Lincoln something. He plays Cousin Cuda in Martin. Go listen to our Martin episode.
Right. Yeah.
And he's the lead character, and only George Romero could take an industrial film that was trying to show like, oh, how hard it is for old people, where it's like, I've seen so many of these types of films. They're one of the best things about Mystery Science Theater 3000 is watching industrial films, like, and these things that were made by marketing firms. George Romero could have just made that where it's like, here's a very simple scene of an old person is trying to get a loan and they can't get a loan. And the narrator comes in like, sometimes it's difficult for older people in our society to get the money that they need for endeavors that they want. That ain't George Romero. He's like, let's take over an amusement park for probably a weekend, and let's make this weird, surreal art film where the amusement park represents society. It's wonderful. It's this one, like to illustrate how old people have it tough driving, they use the bumper cars. Like, fucking brilliant. Like, it's so George Romero in his cameo is this guy in a bumper car, and he signals the wrong type of turn. Like, he signals a left turn and takes a right or whatever. And this old person knocks into him. So he gets out. He's like, what the hell? You bumped right into the back of me. I don't know. And it's like, oh my God, I can't believe they're doing this. Like, this is that community. Like, it feels like a movie I would have made when I was in middle and high school, but made by an adult man with money and a genuine artistic vision. Like, there's a vision in this industrial movie, which never happens. Like, so that alone is wonderful. Like, it's wonderful to see. And it goes to like bizarre. It's essentially a vignette film, where this old man, just runs into different issues being old in this amusement park.
I got to see this.
It's weird. I mean, it's weird. It's genuinely weird in that context. Now, all this discussion about like, this is an unearthed masterpiece that is shattering, that all of that hyperbole is bullshit. Like, that's actually, I think, doing a disservice to what it is, because what it really should be is like, this proves why we didn't appreciate George Romero, because he could take a crappy gun for hire job and make art out of it. That's impressive. But it's not some like, my God, this is one of his most incredible pieces of work. Look at the biting commentary. It's like, no, man, Lutherans were paying him to tell him it sucks to be old. Like, that's what it was. And that's okay.
I can imagine, though, I can imagine why this got lost. George Romero returns to all the Lutherans with the movie. He goes, well, I finished your movie.
Exactly.
And the Lutherans go, oh, yeah, cue it up, bud.
Exactly.
And
I mean, there's like
stunned.
There's a specter of death that shows up in like quick cuts in this. At one point, the amusement park is just magically vacated of people, and a biker gang shows up and beats up the lead. Like, it's awesome. It's a wonderful expression of his talents as an artist within the confines of having to make this thing. And I'm sure that, like, that's why it was lost, was like, he made it and then they were like, what the fuck is this art film you made? Why did you make an art film out of our PSA? Like, that's great. That's awesome. And that shows kind of, I think, his lifelong subversive nature. It's worth it for that. But I do think the discussion, the hyperbole around it being this, absolute nightmarish masterpiece is like, that's overblown. It's still a great watch. Like, it's a wonderful curiosity, and I loved it. So go check it out, The Amusement Park on Shudder. And that's going to wrap it up. And we will be back next week to close out Time Travel Month with a Versus episode. And a Versus episode I really hope you all will be here for, because it's our global gonzo, I believe, as well. Because we're doing some international films. We're doing Run Lola Run, a German film, and The Girl Who Leapt Through Time, which is actually the 1983 live-action adaptation of the film. I know it was made into an anime, I believe, in the 2000s.
It's been adapted a few times, yeah.
Yeah, so The Girl Who Leapt Through Time is difficult to get a hold of. If you go to GenreVision.com and go to our schedule page and you click The Girl Who Leapt Through Time, you will find a way to get a copy of that movie to watch. It's going to be a total first watch for me and Travis. We have no idea what to expect. Run Lola Run will essentially be a first watch for me at this point. It's been so long since I've seen it.
Same.
So very stoked. It's a weird way to end kind of a weird time travel month of movies. So we hope you'll be there. As always, we want to thank you so much for listening. I'm Drew Deitch.
I'm Travis Newton.
And we'll see you next week.
Right here on GenreVision.